So this video is going to be the first in a series of videos that I'm going to make about plugins that can be used both in a stereo production but also an immersive audio production, such as in Dolby Atmos, for example. Now, the main motivation for me for making these videos was that I recently found out that I have quite a few plugins in my plugin collection that are perfectly fine to be used in a Dolby Atmos workflow. I just never noticed that, and I felt I need to talk about it. So the first two plugins I'm going to talk about today are from Sound Particles. It's the Energy Panner and the Brightness Panner. I had actually purchased them quite some time ago and never really noticed that they are perfectly fine to be used in a multi-channel setup. So let's talk about those. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And since you're already at it, also please don't forget to press the like button, especially if you get any value out of my videos. It really helps out the channel and makes my videos more visible to other people. Thank you. Now, the plugins I'm going to talk about today are the Energy Panner and the Brightness Panner from Sound Particles. Now, I'm going to primarily focus on the Energy Panner because the Brightness Panner works in pretty much the same way. So I'm going to show you how the Energy Panner works and how it can be used in a stereo environment and a immersive audio environment. And then I'm simply going to kind of show quickly on how that actually looks with the Brightness Panner. But once again, these two plugins are actually fairly similar and they work pretty much in exactly the same way. Now, in full disclosure, I'm actually in contact with Sound Particles. They had reached out to me in order to discuss a couple of things that they're developing. But this is not a sponsored video. I had actually purchased these plugins long before I got in touch with Sound Particles. I think I even purchased them before I started my YouTube channel. So these are things that I actually have in my collection for quite some time. And everything that I'm going to say is strictly my own opinion. Nobody had any influence and nobody's going to see that before I publish that video. And with that being said, let's do some panning with the Energy Panner. Now, I'm going to use a very simple project today. I'm going to work with Cubase and I'm going to work on a Mac. However, everything that I'm going to show you works pretty much identical on any other digital audio workstation that is capable of handling immersive audio. And there's also no particular need for a Mac system. It works on Windows in exactly the same way. What I have here is a Dolby Atmos project. If you are not familiar with how to set up Dolby Atmos, I invite you to watch one of my previous videos where I actually showed you how to set up a Dolby Atmos project in Cubase. Here I'm going to just go through the very basics. So what I essentially have here is I have a drum track, or I have a drum loop on an audio track, and that audio track is routed into a bed track. That bed track serves as a 7.1.2 bed in the Dolby Atmos project. It is routed into a Dolby Atmos renderer that sits on a Dolby Atmos bus, which is a 7.1.4 bus. With that being said, let's just have a brief listen on how that actually sounds. Now, the reason I'm going to use a drum track is simply because it is the best way to demonstrate on how the Energy Panner actually works. Now, there are really two things that I want to show today. First, I'm going to show you how to use the Energy Panner in a stereo setup. And for that purpose, I'm going to drop the Energy Panner just on that audio track. And then I'm going to show you how to use the Energy Panner in a immersive audio setup. And there are really two ways on how we can do that in Cubase. But let's first of all kind of just use the Energy Panner and for our drum track and kind of see what we can do with that. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to simply drop an instance of the Energy Panner onto our drum track. So let's open it up here. And as soon as I open that up, I see this user interface. Now, when you open up the Energy Panner for the first time, you might be a little bit confused about what's going on here. And I think this is one of the reasons why this plugin doesn't get more attention. That is, even though the user interface is very simple and very straightforward, it does not immediately become clear on what it actually is and what it does. So I'm going to kind of go over a couple of things, but in order to make a little bit clearer of what the Energy Panner actually does, let me first first kind of make a couple of changes to the initial settings that I have when I open up that panel. So the first thing that I'm going to do is in the start section here, I'm going to change the start from point to here start from the speakers, because that will make a little bit clearer on how that plugin actually works. Now, as soon as I do that, I see that here in this circle area, I have the left speaker and the right speaker, and I have this third point here. And this third point really represents a mono signal. And the idea is that the energy panner is going to pan the stereo signal in such a way that it moves from the left and right speakers towards this mono signal. And the amount it moves depends on the energy that signal brings. So if there's a lot of energy in the signal, the left and right channel will move closer to the position of that mono signal. And if there's less energy, it will actually be further away. So let's just have a look on how that, listen and look on how that actually looks and sounds. So let me just play that loop again. Now, there are a couple of things I need to change in order to make that a little bit more visible. So let me just change the threshold here. And I'm going to, in a second, say what the threshold really is. And then maybe the ratio here. Let's move that a little closer. So the idea is that the left and right channel are now kind of bouncing with the energy of the signal towards the position of the mono signal. So if I'm moving that around, essentially the objects or the left and right channel are panned accordingly. Now, before I go into a couple of details, there are a couple of things that I need to clarify, because it does not really become immediately clear what's happening here. Now, the first thing that I need to point out is that the position of this mono signal here is not in a two-dimensional plane. So if I'm moving that mono signal closer to the listener, it doesn't necessarily mean, or it actually does not mean that the signal is coming closer to the listener. The way you have to look at that visualization is that this is actually a sphere or a dome, a half sphere. And if I'm moving that mono signal closer to the listener, what I'm actually doing is I'm moving it on top of me. So this sort of is a sphere if viewed from the top, and moving that point around essentially means that I'm moving the point around on this particular sphere. So moving it closer to the listener, once again, doesn't really bring it closer, it just brings it on top of me. The second thing I need to point out are these little curves here, so these trajectories. So the left and right speaker are essentially moving on these trajectories. Now, these look a little weird, and I have to be perfectly honest that I am not completely clear why they look the way they look. And I actually kind of asked the question to Sound Particles. I did not yet get an answer, but I'm hoping that eventually they will come back to me. Now, for those of you who have been watching my channel, and I'm honestly not completely sure if I ever said that, but my initial training was actually in mathematics. So I'm a mathematician. My first terminal degree was a PhD in applied mathematics. So when I look at those curves, the first thing that I thought was that these at least look like spherical cycloids. If you have no idea what that is, don't worry about it. But sort of it was a little bit of a flashback for somebody who kind of started out in mathematics. Now, the reason I'm bringing it up is because if you encounter curves of that nature, it's usually because of some mathematics in the background. So my feeling is that these curves, or the way these curves look, are not a creative choice by the developer, but they are rather a necessity of the mathematics that underlies the algorithm that kind of pans the signals. So with that being said, essentially be aware that these curves are a little bit weird, but they probably kind of have to be that way in order to make things work in the way they work. Now, there's one additional option that you have. So let me just start the audio again. Instead of having the panning going in this way that it essentially bounces towards the mono signal, you also have the option to really slide those. And what sliding really means is that instead of kind of bouncing back, what they're going to do is they're going to kind of move on these curves. And you sort of see that these are kind of these cycloidish curves where these left and right channel are moving. And that gives a very interesting impression because things are suddenly moving around. And once again, it's not necessarily kind of moving on a two-dimensional space. It's really moving on this sphere. So these two left and right speakers are now kind of bouncing around on that sphere. So that's an interesting kind of creative thing to do. Now, for the remainder of this video, I'm going to stick with the panning version because, quite frankly, that is a little bit more obvious what's going on here. Now, before I continue, a couple of things that that you can change. So for example, if you don't want the signal to be bouncing from left and right speaker towards the mono signal, but the other way around, you can do that by simply clicking on that button here. That will essentially invert or kind of change the direction of the signal. So if I'm clicking on that button, what's happening now is that the signal is starting out at the mono position and then essentially kind of moving towards the left and right speaker positions. And you can also kind of do that here with the start position and the movement position. So you can select whether or not the starting position is in the original speaker positions or it is in the mono position. And you can also choose whether the movement is moving towards the speaker positions or towards a point position. And then there are a couple of other options here. So for example, you can also kind of have them rotate around you, but that's a different story. Now, in terms of controlling, and let me just stop that here, in terms of controlling how much the panning is doing or how much panning is actually going on, you have 4 controls here, and these controls are actually kind of very smart. I actually like the way Sound Particles did that because it works pretty much like a compressor. And so you have a threshold that kind of tells you when the panning actually starts. So how much energy do you need in order for that panning actually to kind of start out? Then you have sort of a ratio. That ratio sort of almost kind of, it really kind of represents the speed with which the panning is happening. And then you have an attack and a release. And if you're familiar with compressors, these things are fairly self-explanatory. Attack essentially means how fast you're starting out, and release essentially how fast it's going to come back. And they can be linked or they can be unlinked. There also is a randomization button here, which is nice. And you also have a side chain option. So if you want to control that through a side chain, you can do that as well. You also have a dry wet knob, which is self-explanatory, and you have a gain knob, which is also self-explanatory. Now, one thing that I did not notice when I originally purchased these plugins is that in the output section, you can actually select different output options. And obviously, these are constrained by the number of channels that you have. In this particular case, this plugin sits on a stereo track. So essentially you have 2 channels, and that means that anything that is 2-channel based is fair game. So you have different options for binaural audio, really, that's what it is. And you have the general binaural setting. But if you have higher channel counts, there are different kind of channel configurations that you can use, and we're going to use that a little later. You can even go as far as to output that in ambisonics, in first, second, or third order ambisonics, and that is actually fairly nice. So if you are working with this particular plugin in a stereo setting, there are a couple of things that you can do. You can work with it creatively, but you can also use that for achieving certain objectives. So one thing that you can do, for example, is that if you have a production where you have one instrument that you want to bring into focus or into the center of your production as soon as the energy starts, you can actually do that with that energy panner. So you can essentially tell the energy panner whenever the saxophone, for example, is starting to play, move that from the sides into the center. And there are a couple of different options or a couple of different things that you can do that actually make this plugin very useful in that particular aspect. Now, one thing that Sound Particles actually showed me was an application where they had 2 vocalists, a lead vocalist and a backing vocalist. Actually, it was a male vocalist and a female vocalist. And they would switch roles between lead vocalist and backing vocalist like you would normally do in a duet. And the way they had set that up is that whenever the one or the other became the lead vocalist, essentially the energy panner would move the voice into the center of the production so that they would never kind of clash in terms of the spatial location. So they would always be spatially separated. And that, I think, is actually a very nice way of kind of using this plugin in a way that actually kind of achieves a certain objective that you otherwise would have to do through automation. So this plugin is already pretty nice if you put it on a stereo track, but where it really shines is when we use it in an immersive way. And the way I'm going to do that now is I'm going to show you 2 ways how you can do that in Cubase. In Cubase, you can either put the plugin directly as a panner onto the track, or you can also put that as a plugin onto the bed track, for example, or any immersive audio track that you're using. Could even be an ambisonics track. So let's first kind of put it as a panner, or kind of use it as a panner. Now for that, let me first get rid of the instance here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply remove that energy panner that I set here. And yeah, let's discard that. And And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first take the energy panner and I'm going to use it as a panner for the drum track, or for how the drum track is sort of panned into the beds track of my Dolby Atmos production. And for that purpose, all I really need to do is need to right click on the panner here, and I'm going to select as a channel panner my energy panner. And as soon as I do that, it shows up. Now, the main difference now is that it shows me these 7 speakers. That is sort of the location of the speakers this is kind of routed into. So this is sort of where it pans into. And I also see that in the output section, it also recognizes that I'm routing into a 7.1.2 track, which essentially means that it is routed into the bed channel. Now, let me just kind of do the same thing that I did before. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the starting position, having essentially the speaker positions, and these are essentially left and right speaker in my stereo setup. And once again, I now have the panner kind of panning into a mono position, and I can move this mono position around on this sphere, and essentially have it panned that way. So let me just play the audio again so that we see on how that is now looks. So as I'm moving that around, I can see in the output metering that all the channels are active. So I have the left, right, center channel. There's nothing going into the LFE channel, obviously, but all the other 9 channels are kind of active. So if I'm putting that here on top, and once again, if I have the mono signal on this circle here in the center of the circle, what it really means, it's really on top of me. That essentially means that this mono signal sits right between the 2 height speakers. And you can actually see that here in the output. So that's an interesting way on how to pan a signal into the bed channel. And that might be useful in certain situations, but the more likely way to use that is really as a plugin within the bed track itself. So let's just check out how that looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to the original channel panner. That was the multi-panner here. And instead of having the panning device or having the energy panner as a panner of the track that moves the track into the bed channel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an instance of the energy panner onto the bed track itself. So let's just open the bed track here, and let's open up an instance of energy panner. Energy panner, here we are. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to set the start point to be our speaker positions. And now, because I'm actually on a 7.1.2 track, I see that I actually have 9 speakers now that are in the position. So I have the left channel, right channel, center channel, I have the surround channels, and I have the 2 head speakers. And the mono position is now once again on the sphere, but the way the panner now works is that all these speaker positions are panned towards the mono position simultaneously, and essentially are moving that way. So let me just play the sound again. Let me just close that thing here. Don't need that anymore. Let's play that again. Let's just change the threshold a little so that we have a little bit more of a visibility here. So these 9 channels are now moving towards the mono position here, and I can do once again the same thing. I can change the direction. So in this case, now as everything is moving away from the mono position, and I can move that mono position around. Now, one thing that I didn't mention yet is that because the mono position is on this sphere, it's actually on top of me. But as you might be aware, essentially a sphere also has kind of a bottom portion. So what do you do if you want to actually move that mono position underneath you? And the answer to that is very, very simple. You have to hold the shift key. So if I'm holding the shift key on my keyboard and I'm moving that around, it now moves the location of that mono position underneath me. So it's in the bottom half of that sphere. And you can actually see that here from the trajectory. So if I'm looking at the trajectory of the head speakers, for example, this is kind of moving towards the horizontal plane and then essentially moving below. right? So if you want to have a location, or if you want to have the mono source or the mono position of that signal underneath you, you simply hold the shift key, and essentially it's going to hold to move that underneath you. If you're working with Dolby Atmos, you're aware that having something underneath you doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because Dolby Atmos has no speakers underneath you, so there are no speakers below the listener position. So we really only work with the top half of the sphere anyway. So let me move that back to the top half here, and then essentially we have this kind of weird kind of spiderwebby kind of thing that looks really interesting. But I think once again that is a mathematical necessity from the algorithm. Now, with that being said, there's also a second plugin that functions in pretty much the same way, but pans not according to energy, but pans according to brightness or pitch, and that is the brightness panner. And so let's have a look at that. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to replace the energy panner that I have on the bed track with the brightness panner. I'm only going to show the brightness panner in the context of this bed track, so only in the context of the 7.1.2 immersive audio track. If you're working in stereo, it works exactly the same way. It's just stereo. That's all there is to it. So let me just replace that. So let's go into the bed, and let's replace the energy panner with the brightness panner. Here we are. And I'm going to discard that. And here we have the brightness panner. Now, from an optical perspective, it looks pretty much the same. Once again, you have the same sphere. So this is sort of this dome, the representation. You have the starting position, which is in our case this 7.1.2, and you have the location of the mono position, which once again is located on our sphere, currently on top of the sphere. Once again, if I press the shift button, it moves it underneath me. So you can actually kind of recognize that by these very weird trajectories, because they have to touch the circle around it, because they are, once again, they're kind of going through the horizontal plane. But for most of the applications that we're working with, essentially we're only going to work with things that are above that. So the main differences here really are in the way the panning works. And in contrast to the energy panner, where the panning was done according to the energy of the signal, here the panning is done according to the brightness of the signal. Now, the brightness in our particular drum loop comes from the snare. So what is going to happen here is that instead of kind of reacting to the kick, it's actually going to react to the snare. So let's just play our drum loop. And you can probably recognize that sort of the position of those speakers is moving according to the snare. Similar to the energy panner, you also can do the sliding option. So in this case, the positions of these speakers are kind of moving on these weird trajectories. They're continuing to move, so they're sliding along those trajectories. You have the same controls in terms of starting position, end position, dry, wet knob, gain. You have the same options in terms of output. You can select anything that has up to 10 channels, because we are on a 10-channel track. So you could even do like a second order ambisonics here. And the one thing that is a little bit different is sort of how you actually control the panning itself. In the energy panner, it was more like a compressor type of settings. Here we have a low setting and a high setting. So you essentially you select where, at what hertz level the panning happens. Here it's between 500 hertz and 1000 hertz. And you have, similar to the energy panner, an attack and a release option here. Now, the one thing that's really interesting here is that you're not only able to use brightness as a way to control the panning, you can also control it through pitch. Now, in this particular example, pitch is not really going to do much because we have a drum loop and there isn't really much pitch going on. There's a little bit of kind of jumping around, but let's just, for the sake of showing how that works. So we have here the essentially the signal is just jumping around here in the lower registers. So if we move the pitch setting to lower registers, we should get some panning. And you sort of see how that reacts to the... I probably need to kind of change the high levels. You see sort of how that reacts to that. And the third option is that you can also control that through MIDI. So if you click on the MIDI button here, you have an option to control the panning through MIDI, so that if you play certain MIDI notes on a keyboard or something, the panning would essentially act accordingly. So all in all, really nice plugins. I actually like them quite a bit. Very creative, very unusual, not particularly expensive, and can be used both in a stereo environment as well as an immersive audio environment, in particular a Dolby Atmos workflow. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.